In this presentation, I want to give an overview of what a research design is. Often ask people to do them, whether either as a final assignment in a course or as the first step of, say, a capstone. And what is a research design? What do we mean by it? What exactly are we talking about? So let's look just quickly at what the research process looks like. And I like to break it up into 3 steps. First step is a preliminary stage where you identify and research the topic to develop a research question. This is something that is maybe, it's preliminary, right? It's you're doing it, you're thinking about it. It's where you're kind of you can say, I want to do my paper on, and I'd say the key thing is that when you're thinking about it as a scholar, you should be actively reading up, right? That's what thinking about it means. You should be reading what other people have done, right? Then you get into the preparatory stage where you say, all right, let's get serious about this. I want to do a research project, and here's what I need to do, right? Let me put this thing together. And so we have this preparatory stage. And then you have the actual research stage where you could conduct the research. And basically the preliminary stage, I equate, that leads into the lit review, right? It manifests in the final paper as the literature review. The preparatory stage manifests as the methodology section. That is to say, what goes on there is reflected by the methodology section. Also, the whole paper does to a certain extent, but that's really what we're talking. And of course, the research, you write the whole paper. So these are the 3 steps I see here. And so the research design is the end product, basically the preliminary and preparatory stage. That's what you're doing in a research design. So the preparatory stage, I got 2 things I say that go on here. Now, first of all, in the previous stage, right, prior to this, you should have become very conversant with the question, right, and the topic area, the research that's been done, and you should have a good lit review that provides a narrative, an overarching narrative of the state of the art in scholarly research on this topic. Right? But as part of that, right, there's a little bleed over. There's not a clear-cut distinction between doing that and the preparatory stage where I say, look, first thing you got to do is you've got to develop the question, right? You've seen what everyone has done, or not everyone, but you've seen what's been done. What aspect of the question are you most interested in, right? And that is very important. Also, you are going to want to say, okay, what are the opportunities in there, et cetera, right? But you're going to focus on a particular aspect. Then you're also going to do some conceptual or theoretical heavy lifting. You're going to define the concepts that go in, and you're going to say, all right, this is what I mean, when I talk about social influences on voters, this is what I'm talking about. Or when I describe democracy, right? This is the definition of democracy. When I talk about terrorism, what do I mean? What type of, am I interested in a particular type of terrorism? What are the concepts? How do I define them? Then you're going to want to pose the question in a way that can be answered, right? And what you want to do is get down to, you might have an overarching question, but you want to say, all right, is there a question that I can look at and make an empirical assessment, right? When John Mueller wanted to look at this question of, were the Vietnamese ever going to break, right? If you search for the breaking point in Vietnam, were the Vietnamese ever going to break? I don't know how you solve that. Or we could say, well, let's look at what percentage of their population died in the war and put that in the context of other populations, other countries in wars, and say, were they tough, or where were they on this spectrum? And that would provide an inference, right? And it turns out that they, according to Mueller's research, they suffered a lot more than anyone else. And so, were they ever going to break? Questionable. But you're posing an answerable question, right? And you look at it and you say, all right, what as when you develop the question, you want to consider, okay, what possible answers am I going to get here, right? And what are the alternatives? And you want to say, all right, when I go down this road, am I going to end up, am I going to be able to stick the landing and have a conclusion? I don't know what the conclusion is, right? I'm not predetermining it, but however the chips fall, am I likely to have something that's meaningful, right? So this is what you do when you develop the question. Then you design the research. And once you have your question, your concepts, you say, all right, well, how can I find and test answers? You're going to basically lay out, all right, I'm going to look at this, I'm going to do these steps. It really helps if you have a very clear-cut empirical question to answer. And then you're going to set the standards for success and failure, right? When I look at this, when I look at how many Vietnamese died in the war to see how, were they tough, were they ever likely to break? What's your standard, right? Well, I'll compare it to all the other wars in history, right? The data we've got on other wars. And, where do they fall in that category? That's what I mean. Whenever you look at information, you have to sometimes think, what's the benchmark, or what is going to tell me what inference to draw, right? I'm going to get an empirical answer, but so what? What does that mean, right? Very often that comes from theory. You also have to operationalize variables, identify data, and of course, you're going to outline the steps in the argument or the analysis, right? So that's the research, that's the design, that's basically the methodology section. The methodology section is going to do all of that, although part of it might also be done in the lit review in the final paper. So, what's in a design? Okay, every paper is different, but introduction. And I can't believe I have to add this in here. I have students do research designs and they don't put introductions in, or they do a lit review and they don't have an introduction. What's the introduction? The introduction is not flowery literary references or other things. It's this is my topic. Okay, here's why I called you here today. We're going to talk about whatever the topic is, right, of your paper. And so you introduce, here's the topic, with some kind of, this is why it's interesting and why it's important. Then you go in the lit review, right? The next step is the literature review. And you can't have a research design without a lit review. The lit review puts your research in the context of the scholarly literature, right? And is a very important thing. And it kind of demonstrates why what you're doing is interesting from a scholarly point of view, why what you're about to do is going to advance our understanding on the topic, right? And so lit review is very important. And then, of course, the methodology section. And so this is basically the beginning of a paper, right? And it should be a good research design is a draft of the first part of your paper, the part before the body. Key thing, you're going to lay out the systematic steps you're going to take to answer your research question. It should be very clear to people what you're about to do to try to come up with an answer or to test a hypothesis, whatever. It should be very obvious to people what you're about to do. This lays it out. And so it's a plan. And when like I say, it eventually becomes part of your final written product. And it tells the reader, all right, here's where we're going. Here's what we're going to do. And it kind of sells the idea of, hey, this is going to add up to a basis, some factual findings that will allow me to make inferences about the overarching topic and come to a conclusion. Right? So you're going to lay out the systematic steps. Key thing, you're trying to test or weigh evidence. You are not predetermining the outcome. You may very well have some idea about how this is going to turn out. It would be weird if you didn't. But you are not predetermining. You are not like a lawyer adding up all the evidence on the side of your case. You are trying to conduct a test or a weighing of evidence. That's the key thing. And your design should find you wrong, right? You should, one way you're doing it right is there a path through this design that would lead you to a conclusion other than one you think you're about to get to? Right? Do you have some kind of test? Do you have that in some way in there? If you're doing statistics, you absolutely do. If you're doing a qualitative study, you have to say, can I persuade myself that my initial hunch was wrong? Right? And that When that happens, that's a good sign, right? That you've in fact honestly weighed the evidence to then come to an empirical finding that then gives you an inference, a way to make an inference about the final product or the final question. You must plan for your test to go either way, or you should at least. And you want to make sure that if you find that your hunch is wrong, that it's not duh. We all knew, right? If you were trying to say whether the astrological sign of rulers of national leaders affected their war behavior, and you did a lot of research and found that Scorpios screw up just as much as Pisces or whatever. I don't even know, how that stuff works. But, if you found that that was not the case, everyone would be like, yeah, so that's not interesting. We never thought that was the case. There was no reason to think that was the case. So, you have to be ready to have a negative finding, right? That you had a hypothesis that some independent variable was working, but it turns out it didn't. And you need to plan for your test to go either way. And usually what that means is, hey, if I test this hypothesis, there are people who think this, right? And so if I find that they're wrong, then, well, that you've established that there's some plausible reason to think that this hypothesis was correct or this independent variable had some weight, and it didn't. Now you've learned something about the world, right? So you want to plan for your test to go either way. Very important. Okay, just getting into a little bit more, still trying to stay general here, but if you're doing a quantitative research design, right? And a quantitative research design, what's quantitative is that you're looking at many cases, okay? That you have data, you have a number of observations. If you have an N, right? And you're looking at multiple cases, well, that follows a certain pattern, and that's the kind of pattern you see in quantitative papers. Introduction, the literature review, and that literature review is going to go over the theories, right? What are the different theories? We have a dependent variable, right, that you're interested in. What are the theories about what the important independent variables are, the causal factors? And then that identifies variables, and you get in the methodology section, and you've probably already talked about the different variables that are relevant. And so it's not a big surprise when you identify them as, all right, let's look at these variables, right? So you identify and operationalize your variables. You list the hypotheses to be tested, and you identify your data sources. You say, well, I'm going to, how are you going to measure, right? That's part of the operationalization, right? Where am I going to get the data to measure these things, right? I'm going to measure the variables this way or that way. And where do you get the data, right? You identify your data. And at that point, you're ready to start the research, right? You've identified it. You've got your variables. You are ready to crack open the data set and start, testing running regressions right there. That is where you want to get with a quantitative research design. Most of my students like to do qualitative research. A qualitative research design is, the research design here is, if anything, more important, okay? And it has an introduction, right? We introduce the topic, right? Then you get into the literature review, where you say, all right, what's been done on this topic? And you want to establish in the literature review that this is ripe for a case study, that usually you're trying to say that either there isn't a data set, we don't have an understanding of variables, we don't have consistent definitions or consistent measurements across cases. So we have to look at, that could be one reason you're doing a qualitative study. Another reason is it could be complex or contextual in some way. And so there's some idea in your lit review, you're trying to get at, why you're trying to do this and what the theories are, right? And you might end up having a different structure, right? You might have a whole section on different theories about why, whatever your topic is, right? And whatever you're looking at, there might be different theories of how best to protect against cyber threats, or, how to defeat terrorism, or, there could be a lot of different ideas out there. And the key thing is you're going to go into the theoretical framework, right? you always need to do that, but here it's a little more in depth because variables aren't defined, in quantitative research, variables are defined very precisely, and, we measure them and we get data. Here, our variables are a little looser, a little broader in scope, and more, there's more meat on that bone. You have to assess what, you might have a category. What does it mean to have a more offensive cyber strategy than a defensive one, right? And well, that's not, it's not a 1 or a 4, right? Or we can't reduce it, code it to a number. That's more involved and complex. So, and that's usually why you're doing a qualitative study. And so the theory is going to be more important to understand in some greater depth. So what I'm saying is your literature review, or you maybe have an additional theory section, you're going to develop a theoretical framework. What is the thinking on what occurs, right? With a qualitative research design, you should still have a dependent variable. You should have a bunch of theories saying what are plausible causes for that dependent variable, right? What are the independent or explanatory variables or conditions, or, it's not quite exactly a variable, right? But what are we thinking is causal? What are the causal mechanisms in the world that are producing this outcome that you're studying, your dependent variable? Well, we want a theoretical framework for that. The methodology section, this is what's so important. The methodology section, whether or not it's in methodology, we need to have a theoretical framework that's going to say, all right, here's what we think, here's some ideas about what's probably going on. And that's what we're going to look for, right? Because this is the key thing. The theoretical framework tells you and tells the reader what to look for in the case. And it acts as a filter for all the, the uncountable, it's not infinite data, but it's uncountably many, right? That's what they say, like they're not infinite grains of sand on a beach, but they're uncountably many. Probably the same is true about facts in any given case. Well, what ones are you going to look at? What ones are you going to ignore? The theory provides that. And so you want to say, all right, here's what I'm looking for. And then when you find it, how do you interpret it, right? What's it mean when you find that the U.S. doesn't allow malicious, counterattacks with cyber stuff? I don't know. What does it mean? The theory provides a context for interpreting the information you find. It tells you what information to look for, gives you a context for saying, okay, here's what we found, and this is what it means, right? So that is in there, right? In your methodology section, or, you might not have those exact labels. So that's one big part of your methodology, and part of the research design is this theoretical framework. And then you have to identify and justify your selection of cases, right? You have to say, okay, these are the cases I'm going to look at. And that's a big part of the research design. You say, these are the cases, 1 case, 2 case, 4, whatever. It's a small number usually. And identify and justify their selection. So that's what goes into